It's time to talk about conditional statements such as negations, converses, inverses, and contrapositives. What do those words even mean? So basically, conditional statements and the different types are all about finding different ways to say like the same statement. So our first example of a statement is I like cats, which for the record is not true. Now, when doing conditional statements, we usually give a letter to these statements so that we don't have to keep writing them out over and over. And for doing math and logic, we usually use the letter P. Why do we use the letter P? I don't know. So the first type of conditional statement that I talked about is called a negation. Now we have a special symbol for negations, and it's basically just putting a little squiggly in front. So if you have a little squiggly in front of P, then that means it's the negation of P. And notice how this kind of sounds like negative, and that's because it's literally just the opposite. So if statement P is I like cats, the negation of P is I don't like cats. So there you go. These are negations of each other. They're just the opposites of each other. Now, when doing logic problems, usually just having one statement on its own isn't very helpful. Usually you combine two of them to make an if-then statement. So notice how this is actually two statements. It's saying if this first one is true, then this second one is true. So if it is true that you are on the basketball team, then it is true that you are an athlete. And that makes sense, right? If you're on a sports team, then that makes you an athlete. That's like the definition. So this is actually two statements with two different letters. So the first statement is you are on the basketball team. And we're going to give this the letter P like we did before. But we actually have another statement here, which is you are an athlete. And we're saying that that's true if P is true. So for the second statement, we'll give this the letter Q. Now, if you're trying to give an if-then statement, if you're trying to say that if P is true, then Q is true, then we use an arrow. So to symbolize this, we're going to put the letter P and an arrow pointing to the letter Q, because we're saying that if P is true, then Q is true. So let's start talking about those other three kinds of statements that I talked about. The first one is a converse. Notice how this sounds like convert, and we're basically just going to convert it into the other way around. So if this statement is if P, then Q, then its converse is going to be if Q, then P. So what does this mean? Well, this turns the statement into if you are an athlete, then you are on the basketball team. We're flipping around the statement. So is that true or not? Well, it's not true, right? If you're an athlete, you're not necessarily on the basketball team. You could be an athlete and be on the football team or something like that. So in this case, the converse is false. Another type of statement that I mentioned at the beginning was an inverse. So what is the inverse? Basically, the inverse is going to be the same statement, but we're going to take the negations of both. Remember, that's just the opposite. So we're basically going to put little squigglies in front of both P and Q. So what does this make the statement? Well, that means we're going to turn both of these statements into their opposites. So now statement P is not you are on the basketball team, but now it is you are not on the basketball team. And statement Q is not you are an athlete, it is you are not an athlete. So let's see if this statement makes sense. If you are not on the basketball team, then you are not an athlete. Well, I mean, that's probably not true, right? I mean, you can not be on the basketball team and still be an athlete. You could be an athlete in some other sport. So in this case, the inverse is also false. Now, the last type of statement that I talked about was contrapositive. And that's basically combining the converse and the inverse. So not only are we going to flip Q and P, so it's going to be if Q then P, but we're also taking the negations. So we're going to put the little squigglies in front of both of them as well. So we're combining the last two. So what does this make our statement? Well, because we have squigglies, we're going to leave the knots, and we have to read it the other way around. So it's saying if you are not an athlete, then you are not on the basketball team. Is that true? Well, yeah, you can't not be an athlete but be on the basketball team, right? That doesn't make sense. So the contrapositive of this statement in this case is true. So here's a little summary of all of the different statements I talked about. We have our original, our converse, our inverse, and our contrapositive. So you might notice that our original statement was true, and our contrapositive was also true. And this is always going to be the case. They're always going to be the same truth. So for example, if the statement that we originally started with was a false statement, then its contrapositive is also going to be false. And converse and inverse will also always share the same truth. So for example, if the converse was true, then the inverse would also be true. So they share the same truth. So now you know about the different types of conditional statements and how to tell if they're true or not. But you may have noticed that the title of this video is called Geometry. And you're probably wondering, what does this have anything to do with geometry or math or anything? Well, that's because this is the first step in preparing you to do proofs, which is probably one of the most important things you'll have to do in geometry. But there's a lot that you have to learn to prepare to start doing proofs. So if you want to continue on that road, then here's the next video that you'll want to watch to start learning proofs. And if you have any questions about this video, go ahead and leave it in the comments, and I'll be sure to answer your question. Thanks for watching.